Okay, I'm John Hadlow. I'm an education consultant, but I'm also a teacher in secondary schools, further education, and in higher education. And what I'm going to talk about today is really a journey. I was asked by a young person who was coming to the end of their A-levels, should I do a degree, should I look at apprenticeships? My mum says it's all a disaster out there for higher education, and I've been hearing about apprenticeships. And I went, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I'll go and have a look. And so what I'm going to do is take you through what I found out during this process. So I've unashamedly nicked most of this from lots of different places. One of the most interesting sources was a report that was produced by the Learning and Skills Network on this that have some interesting figures, so you'll see quite a bit of that. One of the first things this person said to me was, of course, it's going to cost a fortune for me to go to university, isn't it? So I did some investigation into what does it actually cost. There's lots and lots of figures bandied about, and it is surprisingly difficult to come up with a figure of what it would actually cost a young person to go on to a typical degree course of 3 years and what it will cost. There is a survey which came out in 2011 by an organisation called Push, which are independent, although some universities don't think they're as independent as that, particularly the Westminster, who got quite criticised as being the most expensive university to go to, and they said that it's going to cost sort of £50,000 to £60,000. Now, not all of that is debt accrued by loans. It's interesting there, I noticed that parents, they will owe 13% of that debt is owed to parents. Parents continue to be the bank for many students. I don't think that's new. I think parents have always bailed their kids out. Certainly my parents did when I was at university many years ago, bailing their children out when they come home and say, I haven't got a penny, I haven't got anything to do, give me some money. And so they've done that. And credit cards. Many students finishing university with rather large credit card bills. Nevertheless, that is an intimidating figure for many young people at 17 now to be saying, I could end up with a debt of around about £60,000. Now, the response to that is, that's okay, it's fine, because you don't have to pay that back immediately. You pay that back over your entire working career, and graduates earn more on average. So I then started to do some research into how much do graduates actually earn. It is surprisingly difficult to find a really solid, accurate survey that says this is what graduates earn. One that was reported quite a lot in the press recently reported a figure of around about £29,000, which is a fantastic starting salary if you come out of university and you're earning £29,000. On closer investigation, this was a survey of graduates with the top 100 companies in the country. So clearly they are recruiting the best of the best, the creme de la creme, and they are paying accordingly to get the best of the best. And so those graduates are going to be doing very, very well. I went on to a number of blogs as well to look into this issue. And on a lot of those blogs, there were many graduates going, I would dream of earning even remotely close to £20,000. Many graduates are unemployed, many graduates are earning minimum wages, and not a lot of graduates, it would appear, and again it's hard to find accurate figures on this, are using the skills and the subjects that they studied at university in their immediate employment. Graduates are taking jobs in all sorts of areas that are not necessarily related to the courses that they studied or to the skills that they were developing on those courses. And again, that's not particularly unusual. I think what's happening is that there is almost a culture developing of degrees are not what they once were. They're going to cost you a fortune. They're not an automatic entry to employment. They're not going to automatically earn you a fortune, and you will be paying back a lot of money. So there are a lot of young people now saying, I'm not sure about a degree. I'm not sure if that's what I want to do. And so the group I'm particularly interested in talking about are really those ones who may have been doing A-levels or A-level equivalents or coming to that position of thinking about that and are looking at alternative progression routes through. Now, the other thing this young person said to me, sorry, I jumped that one, was, will I be needed? Whatever I do, is there going to be a future which will require somebody like me? Because everybody's telling me, my mum and dad are telling me, it's all being flushed down the toilet. The economy is dreadful, there's not going to be any work, we're all going to be living in devastated cities, gnawing on the bones of dead dogs, and that's the future. So I then did some exploration to see what the top economists, they're clearly predicting the future. Oh, so I must get back. The difficulty of predicting the future. When I was a young person, I was promised the jetpack. I was told when I was about 13 that the future, now, I would be able to go to work with a jetpack. This is pretty much guaranteed on a program called Tomorrow's World. If you're old enough to remember Tomorrow's World, not only would my cooking be done by a robot, and I wouldn't have to do that, but I would have a jetpack. I'm still waiting for my jetpack. The problem of predicting the future, of knowing what the future holds, extremely difficult. Nevertheless, a number of key economists have been looking at these kind of issues, and I was listening in on a number of Radio 4 programs, which are at the moment sort of saturating the airwaves with programs on the economy in the future and what's happening. So, key, will there be jobs for young people in the future? Is it worth investing? Is it worth a young person investing? You know, we hear a lot from governments and from employers about investing in the future, but if you're 17, you're being asked to make, you know, deferred gratification decisions on speculative ideas from people in grey suits that you don't really know that at some point in the future it will all come good for you. And in what kind of economy will that be? What sort of thing is going to drive the economy forward becomes another key issue. And another one, the young person said to me, it's not going to matter, I need to learn Chinese because they're going to rule the world. It will all be Chinese. We're just going to be some tiny little satellite doing absolutely nothing. And unless I can speak Chinese or live in China, then I'm not going to have a job. I'm going to be asking, do you want fries with that for the rest of my life? And then what is going to be the skill set that's needed for the future? Now, everyone was pretty clear when I did my trawl through this that the next 5 years at least are going to be pretty tough. There is not going to be an immediate turnaround and things are not going to suddenly get better. Now, estimates of how long the tough years are going to go on vary enormously, but 5 years seem to be about the minimum that I could come across. Some people were saying towards the end of the decade. Towards the end, the end of the decade is when we may begin to see a change taking place. Now, Will Hutton is a big media figure. I found lots and lots of quotes for him that were very interesting on this. But what he was saying was what is absolutely certain is there will be a wave of new technologies. There is at the moment in development and in innovation a wave of technologies of amazing kind that will be working their way through. And it will take 5 years, it will take 6 years, it will take 7 years for those to work their way through to a point where they actually become something which is commercially available, marketed to everybody and readily available. But these are on the way. He was absolutely adamant in the number of speeches that I heard him and radio interviews he was giving is, although things are bad now, that does not mean that they will always be bad and that there isn't going to be a need in the future for something. But he will be particular about exactly what would be needed in the future. He goes on to say that what we're going to have to do, and what we are very bad at in Europe, not just in the UK, in Europe, we are very bad at making those future investments. We are very bad at looking at those processes and investing in knowledge and skills now when they're not necessarily going to pay dividend either to employers or to employees or to young people and students, but they will do in the future. And his argument was very much, if we don't begin to do it now, when it all does begin to kick off, we won't be in a position to draw upon the kind of skill sets, the attitudes and the young people with the qualifications they're going to need to be able to make the most of this. So although, and you look at this later, he's fairly certain that this will happen in the West, there is no guarantee that this will happen in the UK. Nicola Hollick is again a big thinker in this area, and what she's saying is we've made some mistakes in the past. We pretty much put everything into financial services and then we went shopping. And those were the two things that mattered the most. The enormous amount of the economy was based on financial services, which paid phenomenal wages, and I'm not going to go into kind of talk about financial service crashes, and retail and shopping, and then that was the dominant theme. And that we need to invest elsewhere. We need to look at other forms of investment in innovation, technology, because this is where the new ideas are. And they are all adamant that the ideas there. There was no shortage of ideas. It's been able to turn those into something which becomes productive. And again, very certain that this will happen in the West. I mean, there are a number of programs around at the moment which I think are absolutely fascinating about this kind of what will happen to China. I was reading something recently saying there will be a China Spring. Coming to the generation, finish of the generation that started the revolution in China. They will all be gone soon. And the sustaining revolution through to the next generation is very difficult and very challenging. So there was a kind of prediction amongst many of the political theorists and economists that I was looking at that we should expect something quite major to change in China over the next 20 years or so, a major political change, although China will resist this quite strong. And that because of that, although China and many other countries in that area are very good at taking technological developments and developing them, They're not so great at innovation. They are not so great at coming up with those ideas in the first place. They are very, very good at taking those ideas and turning them into something absolutely massive. An example that was given quite recently was when the G4 Summit went to Korea and nobody's phone worked because Korea's entire infrastructure is based on G4 phones. And nobody's phone, none of the politicians and economists that turned up had G4 phones that worked. Now, G4 was not invented in Korea, but what they've done is put in place already the infrastructure that supports that. So it's the innovation is happening in the West, but the development and the infrastructure development is taking place elsewhere. And what these economists are saying is we need to catch up with that. We need to get better at that. So what the economists are saying is there will be a reinvention. There's going to be a period of slump and decline and then a period of rapid reinvention. And during that period of reinvention, we will need people to fuel this. We will need people to drive this forward. Although for a young person who, next week is a long time. What they're going to wear to a party on Saturday is a long time away. And when you're saying to that young person, no, in 6 years' time, 7 years' time, if you've got the right skill set, if you've got the right qualifications, if you know where you're going and what you're doing, you will be able to make a huge success of your life because it will all fall into place then. And you will either be ready for it or you won't. Now that's a very hard sell to a young person who's 16 or 17 now. It is a very hard sell. It is a very hard sell if you're going to say, and the way of getting to that point where you've got that skill set, where you've got everything that you need, may not be the way that your parents got there, may not be the way that your teachers got there, may not be the way that your lecturers got there. There may be other ways of getting to that point. That's a doubly hard sell because you're saying not only have you got to look forward to the future that's unpredictable and take my word for it that it's going to be there, but equally the route to get to that point may not be the route that all of the people that are giving you the advice went through themselves. And it's all very well, lots of people saying, as we are all saying, this is the route. Very few of us followed that route. If we did follow an apprenticeship route, it wasn't the apprenticeships as they are now. We all got to the point where we're giving advice to young people following a different route than the route we're advising the young people to take to get to the future that we're saying is going to be there. So what I was doing was, this is from the young person's perspective. It is incredibly confusing. And it is very difficult. There's a lot of risk involved in saying, okay, I trust you. Nice suit, got jacket, I trust you. I will do what you say. They're putting a lot into you being right, the economists being right, the routes that you're subscribing being the correct routes to go. And that's quite difficult. So then what I started to do, is to sort of say, so what are the issues? Because we haven't got this right yet, I don't think, for the young person to be able to make a really good informed decision. There are many mixed messages out there coming from a range of different sources, employers, particularly government, particularly policymakers, particularly in terms of how these things are being developed and whether or not they're being developed in the right way to make this possible. For me, this is all potential. Whether or not it will be more than potential is going to depend on whether or not some of these issues, some of these contradictions are actually resolved. If they're not, then we are going to be giving young people advice that they are not going to be able to act upon. If we get it right, then there will be a variety of different progression routes of getting to the point where we're saying, then it will all come good for you. It's not a done deal yet. So I think in a sense I am being a little bit critical here of the apprenticeship context and the apprenticeship landscape, not because of the participants working within it, but because of the context in which those participants are working, the way in which it's funded, the way in which employers are encouraged, the way in which policy directs people to know what's happening. And I think there's a great deal of confusion of that. So some of this quite often politicians talk, you hear them talking about degrees and apprenticeships as if they're equal alternatives. They look at it being value for money. Now, it's clearly value for money for the government, but is it equally value for money for the young person to do that? And how easy is it to progress? Because if we don't have progression routes, if we're not saying to the young person, if you start here, you could go there, that's where you could go, that's the future where you can go with this, then we're asking them to start on a route that'll get a certain way down and then be, what do I do now? And we go, we haven't sorted that one out yet. Well, that's a bit disingenuous, it seems to me. And the real problem of parity of esteem. And again, when I was looking through the blogs, there were a lot of people saying, if you go through an apprenticeship route, if you come up from the bottom, you can do really well. And equally, other people saying, I did that, and then some graduate came past and just completely whipped past me because they're held in high esteem by the organisation. Even though I'm the person that really knows what to do, this person, because they've got a degree, whipped past. So there are questions of esteem, there's questions of parity of esteem that have to be addressed if we're going to genuinely say to young people, go down an apprenticeship route, because it is a way to get to where you want to go, and it's the kind of qualification that we know that we're going to need in the future. So comparing levels, there are at the moment a number of levels in apprenticeships, the immediate, the advanced and the higher apprenticeships, and a huge amount of focus on apprenticeships has been at the lower end. And the reasons for this is because of disengaged young people in schools. Apprenticeships have been focused as an alternative to young people at schools who do not like school, for whom GCSEs and the national curriculum is not a good route for them. And they produce a huge amount of... I work in a school and I teach these kids. Trying to teach somebody who is very disaffected about the Wars of the Roses and trying to persuade them that that's something they need to know is a challenge. It is a challenge. Now, I believe everyone needs to know about the Wars of the Roses, but nevertheless it's a challenge. And apprenticeships were one of a range of programmes that were being offered, young apprentices offered to people as a way that would engage them, that would give them skills, that would take them forward. There are many others. There are university technical colleges being promoted at the moment. A number of those are opening around. For me, that's great, and I don't have any issue with that. I think the problem is that that's happened at the expense of higher apprenticeships. And so for my young person saying to me, I've done my A-levels, what should I do? The problem for them is not that there's a level 1 or level 2 alternative at Key Stage 4, because they didn't go down that route anyway. They were bright. They did their GCSEs. They'd have been EBAC kids now. They maybe did their A-levels. And they're ready now, and they're making a decision. So the huge investment that's taking place in that area is great, but it does leave a shortfall at the other end. And of course, apprenticeships, even where they exist at level 4, and there aren't very many of them, and they're only in certain areas, even where they exist, it's a bit disingenuous to then compare them to higher education, because higher education starts at level 4 and a degree is level 6. So when politicians, and there was a quote recently from the Minister for Skills saying a young person who didn't get a place in university, having applied with an A-level background, should think about apprenticeships, is an interesting question. We'll look at it a bit more, but how real an option is that for a young person looking at their options after having done A-levels, as to whether or not a level 4 apprenticeship, even if they could find one, was going to be a genuine alternative. What is very difficult at the moment is to get any kind of seamless progression between that strand and that strand. It is possible, and I know a number of FE colleges, certainly the college that I work in, has done that very well, because they offer both. And you do this in Havering, don't you? You offer the range of continuation through the whole range, and I think that could be the future. But for many standalone universities, they don't offer this. When they're doing apprenticeships, what they're doing is they are the employers of apprentices that might be working in their catering, that might be working in their support services, but they are not themselves offering apprenticeships in a way in which FE often is. So the blend of FE and HE, I think, is a really interesting future that could resolve some of this. But at the moment, it's an issue, it's a problem. The other one is loans. Clearly, adult apprenticeships, the funding of post-19 apprenticeships is going to rely upon a loan system, very similar to the loan system that's being used in universities. So young people looking at this in terms of the adult apprenticeship model are not going to be free of the requirement to take out some kind of loan. Now, from a governmental perspective, this is good. If you're talking about the cost to the taxpayer, apprenticeships offer huge value for money, because there are very few upfront costs. Remember, the whole loan system is paid for by the government, and then you pay it back to the government over 30 years. Well, that's an immediate cost. Every higher education degree course is an immediate cash cost to the government. These aren't to the same extent anywhere near as high. And of course, they're not paying the on-costs because the employers are paying those. So there is a loan to cover a certain amount of the costs, and then the employers are paying a certain amount. So although young people will have loans to pay back at the end of an adult apprenticeship, they're not going to be anything like as high. Now, that's clearly an incentive to the young person, and it's a major incentive to the government to be promoting these. The other problem they have with higher education is, of course, there aren't enough places. What's bizarre is at the time when many young people are challenging whether or not higher education is for them, it is much harder to get into higher education than it's ever been in the past. There's a kind of saturation point. There's an interesting contradiction. A couple of students I have said their parents have taken them to, there was a huge conference in London recently where people were looking at doing degrees in Europe and in America. Now, the people organising it were saying a few years ago they had about 300 or 400 people. They had 6,000 turn up to this, where people say, should I do my degree in Peru Perugia, or should I do it in Washington State, or what does it cost to do a degree in Milan compared to doing a degree in Luton? And it's very interesting comparisons, and although it's not as simple as that, people are certainly looking at their options around those kinds of choices and looking at where they could go. So interestingly, there is interesting contradiction between, on the one hand, higher education is being considered problematic by many young people, and yet many young people cannot get into higher education. I certainly would find it difficult to get into the university that I went to with the grades that I got 30 years ago. Wouldn't get me into the same university now. It's interesting to look at numbers in terms of, are these genuinely the routes looking at A-levels. I'm particularly interested in A-levels as routes to higher education, as routes to advanced level and apprenticeships. And there's a huge stark contrast, which really says the government's got a big job on its hand if it wants to present apprenticeships as a genuine alternative to these other routes. For example, 100,000 16 to 18-year-olds participating in level 2 and level 3 apprenticeships, but 1 million 16-year-olds in academic and vocational level 2 and level 3 programs. So there's a phenomenal disparity between the young people that are following A-level courses and then not being able to get into university as a result of those A-level courses, and the number of young people following level 2 and level 3 apprenticeships that could take them into other kinds of things and even transfer into HND. Numbers are huge differences between that. And to change that is going to require an investment and a change which I don't see actually at the moment. And we were talking earlier, the blockage is not here, the blockage is often in employers. Where are the employers that will be able to take on board more and increase the apprenticeship? There are many sectors which are already reporting saturation point. They can't take many more apprentices onto the programs. Now again, this is just an interesting take on the relationship between A-levels and other alternatives. 42.9% of 17-year-olds in AS and A-levels, 1.3 participating in level 3 apprenticeships. So the extent to which a level 3 apprenticeship is really there as a genuine alternative against A-levels is, at the moment, it's not being delivered in anything like the same kind of numbers. So a big gap. Right? Participation in higher education is dwarfing participation in adult apprenticeships. Okay? So it's a shift which clearly the government is keen to change. It's not keen to continue to simply expand higher education, and is offering about 4 times as many apprenticeships as it is in higher education places. Now for me that's great as long as those apprenticeships are developed at the higher end. Developing those apprenticeships around level 3 and level 4 seems to me to be the key message here, developing those as genuine alternative routes. So the key question then, back to my student, is should an 18-year-old with a good A-level grade who misses out on university consider an adult apprenticeship? Should they think about doing an adult apprenticeship? Is it really possible? Well, it's the level 4, the fantastic 4 is really the question. In order to progress onto a level 4, in order to progress onto level 4, that young person's got to think about that. They already have a level 3 qualification. They've got their A-levels. They've got their level 3 qualification. If they were to go on to a level 3 apprenticeship, they'd be making a sideways move. If they were going to go on to a level 3 apprenticeship, they would then face the challenge of not having done a level 2 apprenticeship. So for many institutions, and I don't know what it is at Havering, for many places they are very reluctant to let people on a level 3 apprenticeship unless they've done a level 2 apprenticeship before. So to genuinely think of a level 4, the young person may have to take a step backwards in the situation as it exists at the moment. Do a level 2 apprenticeship, go back, get a level 3, they've already got a level 3, in order to progress onto a level 4. And I think that's a hard thing to expect a young person to do. I don't think that's a viable alternative. Now the alternative is clearly then to think about young people shouldn't be doing as many A-levels as they're doing at the moment. The real solution to this is to go back to the point where we're looking at young people making their choices at A-level and say, why is everyone doing A-levels? Why have we got those kind of figures between A-level rates and other qualification rates? How we solve that one, I think, has a lot to do with, again, the culture of schools, the way in which schools are advised, and the traditional routes that young people follow. Many people are going, bright and intelligent young people are going into A-levels, never looking at other alternative routes as being possible, either because the school doesn't offer them, or because they're not held in esteem by parents, or they're not held in esteem by schools. Somebody once said to me, the English educational system has always been plagued by the fact that the more useless a subject is, the higher in esteem we hold it. So Latin is held in a huge esteem, understanding ancient history is held in huge esteem, being able to quote from Shakespeare is held in huge esteem, being able to fix something isn't. And that, I think there is a continuation of that. A-levels, not that they're useless, but they are an academic subject, held in high esteem. Vocational qualifications have never been held in high esteem. And I've worked, in all the time I've worked in education, we have never been able to have parity of esteem between a vocational pathway and an academic pathway. And it has always been a challenge to get the intelligent, bright, sparky young people to move away from what their parents did and what they know, and to move away from A-levels and to look at alternatives. But it is, I think it is not a viable option, as many politicians are saying at the moment, to ask young people at the age of 18 with A-levels who didn't get into university to think about apprenticeships, not as the situation stands at the moment. Now, the notion of this was John Hayes, again, this is quoting from this LSN report on higher education, saying, well, the real problem is at university, you go from being a student to a graduate, you have a graduation ceremony, but when you finish an apprenticeship, you simply become an ex-apprentice. It's a little disingenuous, because you're not comparing like with like. People that are graduating from a degree course are graduating from a level 6, whereas people that are graduating from an apprenticeship are graduating from level 3, typically, because there are so few level 4s around. So it's better to think of these in terms of graduate apprentices and graduate students, and apprentices and apprentice students. You know, level 3 compared to level 3, level 6 compared to, well, there isn't an apprenticeship at level 6 at the moment. So a bit disingenuous to compare like with like. So I think what we're going to need is more level 3 and level 4 apprenticeships as soon as possible. We're going to need that to cover the breadth and volume of areas which we're looking and anticipating from what the economists are saying is going to be the future development. We need those at level 3 and level 4, and we need to start to developing those now so that there are genuine progression routes. We need greater uptakes of apprenticeships of 14 to 16, so there is a progression route from an apprenticeship at level 2 to an apprenticeship at level 3 to an apprenticeship at level 4 to a degree course into HE in that route. It is not easy at the moment as it stands to make that shift at level 3, to cut across at level 3 and then go into another route. And to prevent young people from having to make those difficult decisions. So what did I actually say to the young person? It's difficult to know. With the situation as it stands at the moment, it is very difficult to know what is the right thing to do in that situation. It depends very much on which sector you think you want to go into. It is very dependent upon where your interests lie. It is very dependent upon the extent to which you can defer your gratification. In other words, if you're going to expect a payback on all of this quite quickly, then there are certain routes that will give you that. You may need to consolidate. You may need to get a breadth of skills. It may not be a bad thing to go sideways and do a level 3, as long as you're prepared for the wait. It's not going to happen straight away. It very much depends upon the support that you're going to have. I think these are very, we underplay the importance of families and support networks in all of this at our peril. People that are successful in education and at this kind of education and working their way through this are not necessarily the most intelligent, the most able. They're often the ones with the best support network, the ones with the contact, with the advice and the guidance and the family and the teachers and the consistency. And I think there's a lot of factors that I could play upon this. Consistency of teaching staff, consistency of employer mentoring. It's very difficult if the person who is responsible for you and is teaching you changes and changes and changes the whole time. If you're making a decision which is a difficult decision for you to make, you need consistency through that, and you need to feel that being supported, which is why your program is so exciting and so interesting, because it's providing exactly that kind of consistency. I could go on, but I think that's pretty much it for me. Any questions?
I just wonder why we need parity of esteem.
I think we need parity of esteem if we want to genuinely persuade young people that this is an alternative, that this is a viable alternative for the ones who may consider degrees and consider an academic course as the natural. Parity of esteem means this is different, but it counts for the same. I mean, you can see there isn't a parity. The fact that some employers are prepared to pay £2.60 for getting that apprentice seems to me that kind of indicative of how both employers with apprentices might view a young person on that. It doesn't seem to me that you're taking that young person seriously if you're genuinely prepared, or the training seriously if you're only prepared to pay them £2.60. I think you fall into that idea of exploitation, personally.
The history of education from the 50s onwards, or perhaps the 60s if I'm being generous, has been, let's go back. The history of education from the 30s has been based on all sorts of political and scientific misjudgments, miscalculations and fallacies, starting with the 11 plus and the intelligence test. Is there any way we can remove the politics from education in order that things that are a good idea, like diplomas, for example, advanced diplomas, which were a good idea for some people, are allowed to live rather than to be killed off at the whim of a politician who happens to be a bit of a 50s recidivist?
I think what you're saying is reflecting what I was saying before, consistency. Now, I said about consistency of teaching, consistency of support, but consistency of a landscape that doesn't keep changing the whole time. It is very difficult to encourage anybody to put a huge amount of enthusiasm into many of the projects, knowing that in 5 years' time they could be completely abandoned. I mean, that has been the history of education initiatives, and one of the responses to that, change, try program, is a return to very traditionalism, a return to very sort of straightforward, where you just teach them stuff, and you just teach them the stuff my dad learnt, my granddad learnt, my great-grand, because that stuff doesn't change very much. And I think that, but I'm sceptical you'll ever do that. I think you'll never take the politics out of education, because politicking around education is bread and butter to most politicians, because we all care about it so much. So arguments about this is what we need, holding on to that long enough to make it work. I think diplomas are an interesting example of something which huge amounts of people in education put a phenomenal amount of effort into, just to see it change and become something very different. The idea out of which the diplomas originally grew was something that had a huge, the Tomlinson stuff, a huge amount of support, and you got the feeling that wasn't looked at. Why? Because of politics, because it wasn't politically expedient to go for something that actually had a remarkable amount of educational consensus around it. I haven't seen anything since that's had quite the degree of educational consensus around it as the Tomlinson thing did. I mean, I think what we end up with are kind of watered down versions. But I think the cry for consistency and for a lack of change, knowing where we stand and being able to consolidate these things. In a recent survey, it was found that I think it was something like 20% of employers think kids still do O-levels. Now, if they still think they're doing O-levels, what are they really going to know about all these other qualifications? I work in education, I live and breathe this. I can't keep up with the pace of change, with what's going on, with the changes, not only to the qualifications, but to what's contained within the qualifications. At the very best, the GCSE, you're talking about what does a GCSE in English actually teach you? Well, it doesn't teach you now what it taught you 5 years ago, and what it taught you 10 years ago, and what it taught you a long time ago. Now, that's incredibly difficult for employers to get their heads around, and they don't understand quite often why a young person that's got a qualification in what they think they've got a qualification in actually have a qualification in something else, which is one of the reasons why I think apprenticeships do hold out hope, because the employer is involved in that. They're not just on the receiving end of a young person that comes with a piece of paper and says, I've got that, and they go, oh, I wonder what you can do with that then. I wonder what a B in English means you can do that a C doesn't. Or with apprenticeships, because employers are directly engaged in apprenticeships, in the delivery of apprenticeships, they have a better understanding of what it is that young person can do and the competencies that are embedded within that. And I think quite often that helps with the kind of sense of, I don't get why they can't do it if they're working at that level. Well, it doesn't mean that they couldn't, it just means it hasn't happened yet, and you're part of that.
Thank you for the very informative talk. I didn't know about these things in detail before. I think we should involve, it's a comment and a question, we should involve parents in this understanding as well. Parents are the role models to many kids unless the kids grow 18 plus at least. So if they're taking the lead from the parent that they're not very convincing about higher education, if the child is not to decide whether to take a vocational course or A-levels, then the parents, usually they ask parents, and the parents have to have a stern, kind of very, very clear path. So they need to be educated on these aspects, what we are learning today, that there are pathways, higher education is important. It's very important, it's interesting to get a child slipping into a small job and then eventually getting some attractive promotion and then forgetting that he has to do university. So that's where the parents need to be involved. So my suggestion is that these workshops should be held for both children and parents together, not just for the children, because they have to have role models with the parents too. I mean, Dr. Khalid Shah is an anaesthetist at the Cardiac Center. He can emphasize how important is higher education, how competitive that can become. And if you don't have higher education, just experience, people will not employ you. So I think parents have to be involved in that. I don't know, what is your plan for the future?
I think it is. I think parents are very confused by the education landscape. I mean, they are. It is presented in a language which is very difficult to understand. It is changing the whole time, and there is vested interest in all of these organisations. I mean, many of the schools that I've worked in, I have a vested interest. I have a sixth form. They want young people to do A-levels because they want those young people to stay within the school and to do the courses within that. Getting genuinely independent support and advice on what's the right decision to make is very difficult, I think, from a parental point of view. And it's very hard to go out there. You need to understand this stuff quite well, to go out there and find this out for yourself, or to find agencies which can give you genuine advice. And then I think the other difficulty is we're constantly pushing back the point where we expect young people to make pretty important decisions. I mean, I never made an important decision until I was probably about 25, something that really mattered. Whereas now we're saying, should you do GCSE, should you do A-level, should you do, at 14, young people have been able to expected to make really important decisions that will have a knock-on effect for the rest of their lives. At 14, where they go, well, I like him, I'll be in his class. And that's about as sophisticated as it gets sometimes, and it really is at that kind of level. I want to be with my friends, I like that teacher, I don't like that teacher, those are my choices at 14. What course do you want to do? I've never heard of that, I've heard of that, my mum says I should do this, I do that. And I think we ask a lot of a 14-year-old, a mature 14-year-old, to make decisions that then impact upon the decisions they make at 16, the decisions they make at 18, the kind of courses they might do in terms of advanced studies, and then ultimately whether or not they are genuinely educated for, prepared for, and equipped for a certain sector of employment. And all of that can go back to 14. The challenge of any education policy is allowing that to happen, but also allowing someone to break out of that at some point along the way and go, I thought I liked it, but actually I don't. That's not what I want to do. And that is incredibly difficult in planning a course that both takes someone to a certain point effectively and has parity with other ways of getting there, but equally doesn't lock a young person into an irreversible decision. And I think that's really a hard thing to do. Involving parents in that whole process is absolutely important. But finding an agency that can do it in a way which is genuinely independent and can say to the young person, looking at the entirety of where you are, this is probably the thing that you should consider doing. Because I was a head of sixth form. There was a huge pressure on me to get kids into the sixth form, get them in. It's numbers, it's paying teachers' wages, it's keeping the place going. And all organisations, even though there's a lot more cooperation between institutions now than possibly in the past, there's still an undercurrent of that 16-year-old, we want that 16-year-old, no, we want that 16-year-old, we want them on this course and we want them on that course. And I'd hate to, it's like a pinball. A kid is like a ball in a pinball machine, bouncing around all of these, going to open evenings, getting huge amounts of material. So it all looks good. And then, how do I make this decision? How do I know what's the right thing to me? Or even worse, I made the wrong decision 2 years ago and now I'm locked into that, which can make you feel even worse. And sometimes young people's reaction is this, I'll just go on X Factor actually. I'll just do that. I'll just wait for someone to discover me. I'll go on Every Way is Essex. That's the way forward. And surprisingly, I do have a lot of young people that's how they think their future will evolve. Their future will evolve by being discovered. You don't need to do anything except eventually you'll be discovered and it will all be fine. A bit cynical, but I think that does exist.
When I was at 16, 17, decision-making kind of a stage, I was very, very confused not because it was so difficult, because I had lots of options. I could, join the Air Force. I wanted to fly, but because it wasn't paying as much, and because of the peer pressure, I had to go and join medicine, for example. But to tell you the truth, the idea of going into any of these fields was based on simply, one of my teachers told me. I went to the army center one day, and the selection officer told me that it's based on what you want to be or what you want to have. And at that age, I absolutely had no clue what he was talking about. It took me a decade at least to get some gist of what he was really speaking about. And I think we as parents, we as society, we as representatives of whatever, and you as educationists and politicians, we have lost that thing of telling the children, the young people, that it's not all about translating what you know, what you can do into money. I'm sorry, but I mean, we keep on telling our children and everybody else that you have to go and do this because it will get you more money. I mean, what about making good people? We have lost the use of education, as at the end of the day, 50, 60 years old, you're sitting and reading a book and you can understand and you can enjoy Shakespeare, for example. We have lost that beauty we have lost the essence of education. I'm sorry to say this, that's how I feel. We have lost the beauty of reading a book and enjoying it in its context, not just to get whatever you have to get out of it to pass an exam. And I mean, we are just making probably better economic machines.
I think your point is interesting. I think it is an interesting one. It kind of comes back to your question, but why do we need parity of esteem? I think UK education is probably quite unique in terms of European education having this huge divide between a kind of utilitarian view of you get educated in order to do something very specific and you need to know what that is quite early on and then you get trained for that. An education which makes you a better person, which just prepares you for something which may emerge as you evolve and mature. And I think the problem is that has become very divided in our education system. They're two almost separate trains, and also quite class-based. I mean, there is almost a sense in which education of a vocational type is for a certain sort of person, and education of a more academic type is for a different sort of person, and they don't blend very often. Now, that isn't the case in many other countries, and that isn't the case in many other cultures, but for many reasons to do with how education has evolved in the UK, that's very much the case. And trying to change that, trying to get an element of education for its own sake embedded in everybody's education, but equally getting a sense of education for a purpose embedded in everybody's education, and getting those two things to work together without them being two separate strands, and deciding early on, you've got to be either that, you're going to be a lorry driver, or that, you're going to be a contemplative individual. Make a decision early on. How you do that is incredibly difficult given the cultural history of UK. If you were going to design an education system, you wouldn't start where we are now. You just start again, blank piece of paper. You wouldn't do what we've got now because it just creates kind of problems which other European partners don't get. They genuinely don't get why, for example, so many parents are prepared to spend so much money on sending their kids to private schools. They just don't do it in most other Europe. It happens, but they don't do it in anything like the scope. And I was in France recently talking, sitting around with people at dinner, and they don't get why people in the UK bankrupt themselves to send their kids to a private school, because they just don't do it to the same extent. It just isn't part of the culture.
I didn't want the class system, because that's what made parity of esteem something you didn't worry about. And grammar schools provided a little bit of social mobility. But perhaps the problem is, with education now, that there's nowhere to be socially mobile to anymore, except, I suppose, downwards. You can't go very far up. Does that make sense?
I don't know. See, I think when I'm saying about level 3 and level 4 apprenticeships, it's also the emergence of a technical class, if you see what I mean. It's not necessarily the innovative class. I mean, those entrepreneurs will always come from left field. The person that will come up with that fantastically odd thing isn't necessarily someone who's been technically trained all the way through. There will always be people that have got to build it, they've physically got to put the thing together. In the middle of that is a sort of technocratic class, I think. And I think that, for me, is going to be an emerging area. It's that can suck people up from one end and allow an opportunity for people for the other. And that creation of that technical group, I think, is the emerging economy. It's because the future is going to be in those kind of incredibly innovative technologies. If Will Hutton and these others are right, these technologies as they emerge are going to require that kind of class. So there is an opportunity for social mobility, but I don't think the kind of the really left of field entrepreneurialism that creates something that nobody's ever thought of before. The kind of Facebook kind of thing. You can't train people for that, I don't think. I think that kind of, why didn't I think of that? It's such an easy idea. Well, because you don't think like that. Why didn't I think of Facebook? Why didn't I think of the internet? Why didn't I think of those things? Because they're not. They're not like, why didn't I think of quantum mechanics? I know why I never thought of quantum mechanics. I can't work out why I never thought of Facebook, because it just seems so obvious. But managing all of that, running all of that, making that work, because it is now such a sophisticated technology, seems to me it requires more than just somebody with an oily cloth that can fix something, although I think that will continue. It's going to require a kind of technocratic class, and the question is, where's that going to come from? And there is the opportunity for a huge amount of social mobility, but it is very difficult to see how we do that in the context of an education system which has never had a great deal of interface between the classes in education. Our education system, A-levels were qualifications for civil servants. You know, they go back, and the constant berating of A-levels being watered down and they're not what they once were. You know, there's a nostalgic traditionalism which is just simply embedded everywhere in our culture. Now, why don't we have O-levels? They were proper exams. Why don't A-levels test really difficult stuff? Because they don't anymore. And it's all based on the fact that people pass them. You know, the most horrifying thing to your average Telegraph reader is people pass these things. You know, if they were really good, you wouldn't be able to pass them. The fact that people do means they must be easier. Not that they're better taught, or kids are more aspiring, or more aspirational, or they're really good, or no, they're easier. And breaking down that kind of sense that we want a system not that educates people but selects people. I think that's the real challenge, is an education system that doesn't just... Its point is to fail 95%, and they're the 5% that pass get the esteem. That's how we've pretty much always worked here. And moving away from that causes a huge amount of political problems, because people want to return to, I want to be in the 5% that passes, and I only feel I have value in that 5% if 95% haven't passed. And I don't feel a great deal of value. You know, people say this about going to university. You know, the university had status when nobody went. Now lots of people can go. It doesn't have the same status. So graduate doesn't mean the same as it did before. So there's a sense of not having an education system which is there to simply, its sole purpose is to fail 95%. Its purpose is to prepare people for development, for themselves. Now, part of that isn't just I make stuff, I do stuff, I get paid. This is why I say to my kids are constantly saying to me, why do I need to know this? Because it makes you a citizen, actually. You are part of the decision-making process. If you're going to engage in a debate about environmentalism, you don't have to be a scientist, but you need to understand the debate. If you're going to engage in a debate, if you want to be a person, if you want to be participatory, and if we produce a generation of young people who don't feel they're participatory in society, we've got real problems. You know, what makes you feel you investing in it isn't just I own shares in BP or I've got this. It's I understand a little bit about the world in which I live. I understand the concepts. I understand the culture, the society, and I understand change. I understand where change comes from. I understand about globalisation. I understand that my changing culture is influenced by, you know, all sorts of other countries and cultures. I don't get too protective about my little world because I appreciate that. Now that's stuff that doesn't have an immediate payback value. Doesn't immediately give you more money in your pocket, but actually it makes you happier, it makes you more integrated, and I think that does give you eventually economic benefit, because I think if you're constantly chasing the next big buck, actually you don't settle to that. And sometimes having a sense in which I'm part of a community, I belong, I think it's very difficult to achieve, and I don't think it sits entirely with education. I think young people have a very difficult sense of self. I mean, getting into kind of, you know, they don't know who they are anymore because they live in a world where they can constantly reinvent themselves. So there isn't a this is who I really am that stays the same through everything. Because they can constantly reinvent, they become different people in different situations. So it's very hard to say, who are you now, what do you want to be in the future? I could be someone different tomorrow. You know, I could just dress differently, be somebody else tomorrow. So who I want to be in the future, how do I prepare for that person I envisage in the future at some point? It's incredibly difficult to get a young person to think through. There was a level of immediacy, there was a level of the fragmentation of the now, which dominates young people's thinking, which makes all of this stuff very fascinating to us. But actually young people, to some extent, it's almost an abdication of responsibility for decision making. They do sometimes just want someone to say, just tell me. Just tell me what the right thing for me to do is. Because you know what? I don't get it. But I trust you. And I think that's a role adults should play, actually. I don't think that we've given up as adults doing that. We involve young people at earlier and earlier ages, so I'm carrying on, in making decisions. That actually, we're the grown-ups, we're the adults, we should make those decisions and we should live with the consequences. Doesn't mean to say you never involve the young person, but actually part of being an adult is making those sorts of decisions for people who aren't in a position to do them, and making the right decisions and the informed decisions, and being able to not just follow your own vested interest, not just follow your own but to look at it from the young person's perspective. Instead of just handing it over to a 14-year-old and go, oh, I don't know, you decide.
I think that's wrong. I actually think there's a lot of that going on in education. There's a lot of that going on in a lot of places, and people have abdicated their responsibility to take some degree of, it sounds awful, some degree of control, some degree of say, some degree of ownership of that young person's decision-making process. Otherwise, we're not educators. We're something else.